Israel is depicted as a woman clothed with the sun. Now, the Bible says that when the Antichrist, in preparations to launch the Great Tribulation, he will make war against the woman Israel. And when that happens, there was given to the woman 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into her place, where she is nourished and protected from the face of Satan for 3.5 years. Now, that appears to speak of the United States. Let's face it, Israel has one friend right now on the face of this earth. It's the United States of America.
That's right.
Which just happens to be the nation that God chose to symbolize as the eagle. So it looks like this is saying that the United States will move away from being the center of world power in the end time one world government and will remain a friend to Israel, it looks like, almost to the end. Now, we can't explain what happens to the United States at the Battle of Armageddon exactly, because apparently the United States does not intervene there. God has to come and do the job there. I think God can handle that job, of course, but all of these things are woven into these marvelous visions that John had while he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos. Okay, so we know that Great Britain, Russia, Germany, and the countries of Europe, whoever they turn out to be, the 10-nation union, all these powers are going to move together into one world government. And when they come together into world government, it appears certain that it will be under the auspices of the United Nations. We have seen the birth of the United Nations in 1945, and all of these powers presently function through the United Nations. Most of them are permanent members on the UN Security Council. Now, I find, Eddie, that there's not a lot of information that people have concerning the United Nations.
When you go out and speak at prophecy conferences, and you go out and meet, obviously, many, many people and speak in front of large audiences, how many of them are aware of the... Now, I'm from New York, so I've always known that the United Nations building has been in existence. So, I mean, you know, as a little kid, we used to take field trips to the United Nations. But how many people in the rest of the country are understanding, are aware of what they're all about?
You know, I've been startled. I do surveys when I do my prophecy conferences, and I'll ask, how many of you here know where the headquarters for the United Nations is? And we average 10 to 15% of the people. And this is an above normal crowd, actually. And it's astounding that this organization that is supposed to save the world, very few people know very little about it. And what is frightening is this is the organization that's going to end up plunging us into tyranny. I don't think the UN cares if people know that much about it. They know what they're doing. They're weaving the fabric of the ropes that's going to put this world into slavery. And consequently, I don't think they care if the world is very aware of what they're doing.
Well, who is the UN? Where did it come from? How did we get to have a UN building in New York City?
That's what we need to talk about, because I want to make sure that all of our listeners today really understand that the United Nations it appears certain to be the one world government prophesied here in Revelation chapter number 13. Somehow a great charismatic political leader will arise and will either be the head of the United Nations or perhaps just be a partner with the United Nations, but he will work hand in glove with the UN and usher in this one world government structure. So when Strobe Talbot stated that national sovereignty as we have known it will cease to exist in the 21st century and that we will all answer to a single global authority, you know, there's no doubt in my mind what he had in mind. He knows what the UN is.
Now, Strobe Talbot is who?
Strobe Talbot was the Deputy Secretary of State during the entirety of the Clinton administration, and furthermore, he was Bill Clinton's roommate when they both were Rhodes Scholars in England back in their early days.
Now that's interesting, because Strobe Talbot is an open book in what he believes. He believes in world government. He received one of the top awards that could ever be bestowed upon an individual from the World Federalist Organization, which is a openly pro-one world government organization, international organization. So there's no doubt where Strobe Talbot would have stood. I guess the question we have to look at is, why would President Clinton have appointed him on his first day in office to be Deputy Secretary of State and stayed there for the entire 8 years that he was in office? Obviously, Strobe Talbot reflected Bill Clinton's international vision.
I don't think Bill Clinton could plead ignorance because he was the roommate with this guy, and so he knows very well what he believes. And the fact is, most presidents over the last 50 years have believed in some level of world government, and consequently, all of the seeds we have sown are now on the brink of coming home. Let's take a little bit to just talk about the United Nations and the history of it, because this power, this structure is going to rule the world and is going to usher in the time of the worst tyranny, the time of the Great Tribulation, the worst time that the world has ever seen. So we really need to know what is happening here. If you will remember way back at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson attempted to give birth to an international organization similar to the United Nations. He called it the League of Nations. However, members of our Congress feared that if we joined this international organization, that it would result in the loss of U.S. sovereignty, and they did not want us to lose our sovereignty. They wanted the United States of America to retain its independence. Consequently, the Congress refused to ratify the League of Nations treaty, and when the author of the treaty could not get his own nation to ratify it, the whole thing came unraveled. Now, the purpose was to try to stop war on the face of the earth. 8.3 million had died in World War I. We said we've got to have some kind of an international structure to stop war. Well, it didn't work. 20 years later, war breaks out again. This time, we don't have 8.3 million fatalities. This time, we have 52 million of the world's finest men dead on the battlefield. The cry for some system of global governance. You think you're hearing a cry, right now from different structures. We've got to have global security. We've got to find ways of making sure everyone is safe and secure. If you think you're hearing that now, it was really loud at the end of World War II. 52 million dead. There was hardly a family who didn't have a son that didn't come home, or a father that didn't come home, or a brother that didn't come home. And the world was ready to reach their arms out and to embrace this new structure designed by Franklin D. Roosevelt and others, the structure called the United Nations. The world said, never again. We've got to do something better. We cannot make this thing happen. Well, when all of that was set in motion, a problem immediately arose. And I want to talk a little bit more about the origin of the United Nations in just a moment. But before we do, let me tell you what happened over the next 40 years. There were two nations that were part of the Big Five. Now, the United Nations, even though it was ready to join the United States, though it was ready to join the United Nations, was unwilling to totally surrender sovereignty. So we insisted on veto power on the UN Security Council. That means on the big decisions of war and peace that were to be made, the U.S. reserved the right to say, no, we will not do this. Now, in so doing, our Congress held sovereignty. When the U.S. insisted on that, the other four victor nations of World War II were also given veto power. Consequently, the seeds for the impotence of the United Nations were sown into its structure. The United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China were all given veto power. Well, immediately, the Soviet Union moved to gain in peace what Adolf Hitler failed to gain in war. Immediately, they started gobbling up chunks of Eastern Europe. The United States had to go on to a war footing to withstand the plague of communism, and that caused the Cold War to break out. When the Cold War broke out, that paralyzed the United Nations for the next 40 years because everything the Soviet Union was for, we were able to veto it. Everything we were for, they were able to veto it. So the UN basically was a paper tiger because both of the opposing members of the Cold War apparatus had veto power over the other. Now, this situation went on for a long time. However, when Mikhail Gorbachev burst on the world scene in 1985, he announced a dramatic change in the direction that the world was going. Mikhail Gorbachev said, we are moving from a policy of confrontation to cooperation, and we now want to be a partner with the West. The days for the Cold War are over. Consequently, when the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, that marked the end of the Cold War, and the United Nations once again began to be strengthened so that it could become a bona fide world government.